Let's go ahead now and calculate our financial ratios. At the top, we have a summary of our return on equity, our profit margin, asset turnover, and asset to equity ratios. Recall that's our DuPont identity. Let's just go ahead and link those to the other locations on our worksheet. So as we fill out our worksheet, they'll pick up automatically. Let's pick up our profit margin. Let's pick up our asset turnover. And then finally, let's pick up our asset to equity ratio. All right, let's go ahead and begin with return on equity. Our return on equity, recall, is our net income, which will be on our income statement of $22,000, divided by our total equity on our balance sheet, $44,000. Our return on assets, again, net income, income statement, divided by balance sheet, total assets, $132,000. Our profit margin, also known as our return on sales, will be equal to our net income divided by sales. Now, one of the things you might have noticed right now is that return on simply means net income divided by something. It could be net income divided by equity, which would be our return on equity. It could be net income divided by assets, which is our return on assets, or return on sales or profit margin, which was our net income divided by sales. Our operating profit margin then is simply equal to our operating profit on our income statement, operating profit or earnings before interest and taxes, divided by sales. Our gross margin or gross profit margin equals our gross profit, income statement, divided by sales. So margin is simply something divided by sales. Operating profit margin was our operating profit divided by sales. Gross margin was our gross profit divided by sales. And of course, the FRED margin would simply be FRED divided by sales. Let's move on down to our turnover ratios. Our turnover or control ratios, again, were a measure of our efficiency. Asset turnover was simply equal to our total sales divided by our assets. So income statement, we pick up our sales divided by our total assets on our balance sheet. Fixed asset turnover will simply be equal to our, again, sales, in this case divided by our total net fixed assets, net plant and equipment. Accounts receivable turnover equal to our income statement, again, sales, divided by our balance sheet. We've got accounts receivable. Finally, inventory turnover equal to our income statement, sales, divided by our balance sheet, inventory. Now, in our case, typically we will be using cost of goods sold divided by inventory to calculate our turnover. Many places use sales divided by inventory. We're going to use cost of goods sold. There's just as many use cost of goods sold because costs typically more closely track our inventory values than do our sales price. So instead of sales, we take our cost of goods sold divided by our inventory. So we have an inventory turnover of 1.94. Turnover, again, is simply sales divided by something. We have our fixed asset, or rather our total asset turnover, sales divided by total assets. Our accounts receivable turnover, sales divided by accounts receivable. Our fixed asset turnover, sales divided by fixed assets. And about half the sources will show inventory turnover as sales divided by inventory. The other half will show cost of goods sold divided by inventory. The important thing is, if you're making comparisons between companies, that you're calculating your inventory turnover the same way, either using sales divided by inventory or cost of goods sold divided by inventory, or if you're making comparisons over time, that you calculate it the same way. Let's move on and take a look at the calculation of day sales in cash. Our day sales in cash is also a turnover or control ratio. It measures the amount of cash we have relative to our daily sales. If we were to make, say, $1,000 in sales each day and have $9,000 in cash on hand, then our day's sales in cash would be 9. That is, it would take 9 days of sales to replace the cash that we have available or on hand. We calculate our day sales in cash similar to the way we calculate our AR collection period. The only real difference is we use cash rather than accounts receivable. So if you can calculate your AR collection period, you can also easily calculate your days sales in cash. I find the easiest way to calculate our days sales in cash is to first calculate average daily sales. Let's go ahead and do that. So equals, let's take our income statement, sales divided by 365. So our average daily sales is $612. That's how much we're selling every day on average. Again, these are zeros are omitted, so this is really $612,000. But in any event, what we want to do is we want to take the amount of cash we have on the balance sheet and divide it by 612. So I'm going to go right up here in my equation, right behind the equal sign, click on the balance sheet tab, go up to the amount of cash that we have, and we have $4,000 in cash, and we want to divide that by our average daily sales. And I'm going to put parentheses around that, hit enter, and we've got days sales in cash of 6.86 days. We could have calculated a cash turnover and then taken 365 and divided it by that. We'll see that in just a second as we look at our collection period. Again, an accounts receivable turnover of 4.5 means we're collecting or making a sale, collecting our receivables, making a sale, collecting our receivables, making a sale, collecting our receivables, roughly a little bit more than 4 times a year, which suggests that it's taking on average about 90 days for us to collect our receivables. We can calculate our collection period by taking 365 days in a year, dividing it by the number of times our receivables turn over, and we see we would have a collection period of roughly 80 days. Inventory period, likewise, we're going to take our 365 days, divide it by our inventory turnover. Our inventory is turning over roughly twice a year, which means out of 365 days, it's turning over about every 180 days, or half a year. Our payable period days, again, we would calculate it the same way. If we want, first thing we could do is calculate a payable turnover, which would be equals to our, we'll go to our income statement, and we're going to take our cost of goods sold and divide it by accounts payable. That would be our our payable turnover. And again, we simply take 365 and divide it by that amount. Another way we can calculate our payable period in days, and again, our payable period is simply how long is it taking us to pay our bills, would be take our accounts payable and divide it by average daily cost of goods sold. So let's begin by calculating average daily cost of goods sold equals income statement, cost of goods sold, 129,000 divided by 365. On average, our sales are costing us $353,000 a day. Now we're simply going to again go to the beginning of that, equals, click on our balance sheet tab, and we're going to want to pick up our accounts payable and divide that by our average daily cost of goods sold. So we're going to put a parentheses around what we had in the denominator. Our cash conversion cycle in days. Now, if we had to buy everything on for cash, and it took us 188 days to make a sale, and then another 80 days to collect it, we can see 188 days to sell, another 88 days to collect. Our money would be tied up for 269 days. But we get a bit of a break. We typically don't pay cash for our merchandise, we buy our merchandise on credit. And we are on average taking 21 days to pay, so our cash conversion cycle, or the length of time our cash is tied up, is 247 days on average. I promised another look at the day sales in cash in terms of a cash turnover. Let's do that real quick. I'm going to insert a line here, and we're going to calculate our cash turnover. And again, turnovers are simply sales divided by assets. So equals income statement, sales divided by assets. Our balance sheet, what do we have for cash? 4,000. So our cash turnover would be 53 times a year. 365 divided by the 53, 6.86 days in cash. All right, moving on. Let's look at our leverage and liquidity ratios. Our leverage again was measured by assets to equity, so equals our balance sheet, total assets, 132,000 divided by our total equity of 44. Our asset to equity ratio is 2.97. In other words, we're using $1 in equity and $1.97 in debt to fund our assets. Our total liabilities to assets equals, we'll go to our balance sheet. We're going to pick up our total liabilities. In this case, we only have current liabilities, and we're going to divide that by our total assets of $132,000. So our liability to asset ratio is 66%. We have 66 cents in liabilities for every dollar we have in assets. Liabilities to equity equals our balance sheet, total liabilities, 88, divided by 44. Our liability to equity ratio is 1.97. We've got $1.97 in liabilities for every dollar we have in equity. And that $1.97 in liabilities plus the dollar in equity would fund our $2.97 in assets. All three of these ratios measure essentially the same thing. Our times interest earned ratio gives us, it's a coverage ratio. It sort of gives us an idea how much earnings we have or how much slack we have in earnings in terms of covering our interest expense. It takes our EBIT, which is earnings before interest and taxes, or our operating profit, and compares it with our interest expense. The higher the ratio, the easier it is for our firm to meet its interest obligations. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Maybe it'll make a little more sense when we look at our income statement. So, equals income statement, earnings before interest and taxes, or operating profit, divided by our interest expense. And you can see that with $41,000 in operating profit and $4,100 in interest expense, we have about coverage of about 10 times. We have 10 times as much operating profit as we have in interest expense. And our times interest earned ratio would be 10.1. Our current ratio, that was a measure of our liquidity, recall, and that was simply equal to our current assets, which in this case, $128,000, divided by our current liabilities of $87,000. We have $1.46 in current assets for every dollar we have in current liabilities. Now, one problem with our current ratio is if we want to measure a firm's liquidity, we're particularly concerned with liquidity when it might be having some financial difficulty. Let's say it's not able to sell its merchandise. That would cause some financial distress. Well, if we can't sell our merchandise, that suggests our inventory isn't very liquid. And so let's go ahead and look at something called an acid test or a quick test, which looks and compares our current assets with the exception of inventory with our current liabilities. So equals, parenthesis, let's go to our balance sheet, pick up our current assets, $128,000, exclude or subtract out our $66,000 in current liabilities, and let's then compare that with or divide that by our total current liabilities. And excluding our current inventory, we only have 70 cents in current assets for every dollar in liabilities. Now, we could take it one step further, which is sort of our cash flow liquidity ratio. Rather than comparing current assets to liabilities, our cash flow liquidity ratio looks at our current cash balance along with operating cash flows and compares that with our current liabilities. Note, since we don't have operating cash flows for 1988, we can't calculate our cash flow liquidity ratio or our cash flow margin for 1988. We can only do that for 1989 and 1990. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to take our cash plus our operating cash flows and compare that to our current liabilities. So equals, parenthesis, let's pick up our cash from our balance sheet, $353, plus our operating cash flows, again that's from our cash flow statement, negative, and we're going to compare that to our current liabilities. We've got a negative cash flow liquidity ratio, which means we don't have enough cash and not enough cash is coming in to meet our current liabilities. This suggests we could have some liquidity problems. Our cash flow margin, remember, margin simply means divide by sales. So our cash flow margin is going to compare our operating cash flows and divide that by our sales. How much are we generating in cash from each dollar in sales? So equals operating cash flows, negative $42,000, divided by sales of 617,000. Negative 6.9%. This means that for every dollar we generate in sales, it's costing us, or we have $1.06 or $1.07 in cash going out the door. Not a good long-run situation. We won't stay in business long if we're using more cash to generate a dollar in sales than we actually collect. We can go ahead and calculate or copy those two over to 1990, and we can take all of our 1988 ratios and copy them over to 1989 and 1990. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at the ROE decomposition template and start interpreting some of these financial ratios.